In the early centuries of Islam, Islamic culture and rule became the world's most dominant religious force, and the Islamic Empire established itself as perhaps the greatest of the large Middle Eastern empires. Ruled by centralized Arab caliphates, Muslim-controlled land known as Dar-Al Islam began to see a shift towards decentralization by the late Middle Ages. The Abbasid Caliphate, the long-established central rule of Islam, began to destabilize around the 11th century due to multiple power struggles. The first major shift began as the rulers of Islamic lands became Turks instead of Arabs. Turks, a diverse set of pastoral tribes, largely converted to Islam and formed loose military alliances. They gained power first in Persia, many parts of India, and later Anatolia. Perhaps the most momentous events that solidified a new Turkic era in Islam began with the Seljuk Turks, once slave warriors who essentially became the unofficial rulers of the Abbasid Empire. One of the first major developments in Turkic influence began in India. Turkic warrior factions led multiple invasions starting in the year 1000, and by 1206 the Sultanate of Delhi had conquered a majority of northern India. Islam started to penetrate northern India mainly through low-caste Hindus and other disenfranchised groups to which egalitarian Islam appealed to. The brand of Islam most influential in conversion was Sufi Islam, a branch of Islam that centered around a disconnection from worldly affairs and was much more suitable to Indian ideas and values. India, however, never became a majority Muslim state like other Muslim-conquered territories. This was due to the sharp cultural divide between Hinduism and Islam. Equality for all believers, strict monotheism, and the illegitimacy of religious statues and idols upset deeply rooted Indian ideals of polytheism, the caste system, and religious idols. Islam became concentrated within only the northern part of India and never exceeded 25% of the population. Turks have also established themselves in Persia, becoming for a short while the dominant ruling class. This will all change with the incursions of the Mongols, which invaded not just Persia but the majority of Islamic lands. Turkic dominance of the world of Islam would be put on hold due to Mongol conquest, but would continue shortly after its fall. The Mongols' first major conquest of Islamic lands would be in Persia, and later the Abbasid Empire, both ruled by a Turkic bureaucracy. It would begin with a major siege led by Genghis Khan himself and would end with his grandson Hulegu. The conquest would stun Muslims, as the centuries-long belief of Islam's destiny to expand was upset by the violent and rapid Mongol Empire. The Mongols would stamp their legacy into the lands of Islam with the sack of Baghdad, permanently purging both the Abbasid Empire and 200,000 people along with it. The centralization of Islam under Arabs would effectively end with the fall of Baghdad, and Mongol policies would soon enact themselves. Heavy taxes on agriculture as well as large hordes of Mongol immigrants would damage the agricultural systems in Mongol Islam. The Mongol immigrants turned much agricultural land into pastures instead, creating deserts and reducing much of the Persian economy to waste. Some areas such as the wine industry and silk trade grew due to the Mongols' love of alcohol and the direct connection to Mongol-ruled China. The Mongols wouldn't keep these policies forever, though. Growing fond of the Persian bureaucracy, Mongols would allow Persian officials to handle much of the governance, and eventually they would work to repair the damage on agriculture as well as the damage to cities. Most importantly of all, the Mongols would adopt a concept unseen in any other civilization they ever ruled over. The Mongols would assimilate into Islamic culture. They intermarried with the local ethnicities of Turks, Persians, and Arabs while also converting to Islam. Mongol rule ended in Persia, not by a military campaign, such as in Russia or China, but because the Mongols assimilated so well they effectively disappeared within the various majority Islamic ethnicities. With the dissolvement of Mongol rule, Turkic dominance of the Islamic world continued, and the most important example would be of the Ottoman Empire. Anatolia would be the site of initial Ottoman conquest. Turkic tribes would invade the mostly Greek Orthodox Christian civilization of the Byzantine Empire that controlled the region. The Byzantine Empire, once a great civilization, was by this time falling apart, and the Turks took advantage of this. Anatolia would see a much greater shift in culture due to Turkic conquests than any other Turkic conquested lands that were not originally natively controlled by Turks. And there are several reasons for this. Firstly, it had a much smaller population, around 8 million people, which meant Muslim Turkic immigrants would vastly change the demographics of the area. The Turks also brutally destroyed Anatolian society to a greater degree than in India or Persia or other newly Turkic conquests. Massacres, enslavements, and famines reduced the native Christian population greatly. The Christian identity in Anatolia was also greatly linked to the centralized state of the Byzantine Empire, whereas, such as in India, there was no central state which marked a common cultural identity. When the Turks overthrew the Byzantine Empire in Constantinople, the identity of Greek Orthodox Anatolians greatly suffered. Lastly, the cultural gaps between Christians and Muslims was far less than the gap between other religious minorities that Muslims conquered. Both Christians and Muslims followed an Abrahamic faith, and the work of Sufis greatly emphasized this connection. Thus a distinct Turkish Islamic empire was formed, and shortly after the conquest of Constantinople, the Turkish Ottoman Empire would become the center of the Islamic world.